So, hello and welcome to another tutorial. In this tutorial we're going to make this simple Luma Fade transition. It's not a new idea. Mr. Alex Tech did one, Billy Ribker's done one, and now I'm going to do one. I guess the main thing about my one is it's based on the Anim Curve modifier. So it's completely stretchable. You can make it as long or as short as you want. The other feature that I've put in is, if you notice at the minute, the fade starts in the light areas and goes to the dark areas. You may want that the other way around. You may want to start in the dark areas and end in the light, and we can just change in the inspector here which way around we're going. So now it starts in the dark areas and eventually ends up in the light. It's nothing fancy, it's just a little bit of, I guess, playing with Anim Curves. I think, as with many of my tutorials, it's less about making the actual thing and more about the techniques that I use to do it. Okay, let's get into it. Okay, so here we are on the edit screen. We've got our two clips lined up. They've both got handles so that the transition will work. First thing we need to do is put any transition you want on there. So I'm going to go additive dissolve, as it's the first one on the list. Just pop it in and you can stretch it out. Once it's selected, you can right click on it and convert to fusion cross dissolve. All that does is, as the name supplies, is it changes it to a cross dissolve. But it's a cross dissolve that was built in Fusion and can be edited in Fusion, and that's exactly what we're going to do. So again, come back to your transition, right click and open a Fusion page. This gives us our node tree. Media in 1 is the first clip, media in 2 is the second clip. So you found it, your waterfall is the first clip, the fish is the second clip. So we don't need this cross dissolve, so what we're going to do is do that, select it and hit delete. Okay, so this isn't going to be a particularly complicated node tree. We're going to need a merge node and we're going to need a Luma Keyer. To get the Luma Keyer, press Shift and Spacebar, type Luma and hit return. So media in is our waterfall, is our first clip, that's effectively on top. So we're going to pipe that into the Luma Keyer. We're going to pipe the Luma Keyer into the green foreground input of the merge node, and then the merge node into our media out. Next we're going to take our second clip, which was the fish, pipe that into the background of our merge node. So the way this works is basically the Luma Keyer makes media in 1 transparent to some extent. The extent to which it is made transparent is controlled by these high and low values. So if both values are at 0, then it's not transparent. If we very carefully catch the bar between the two dots and drag it up, it becomes increasingly transparent, starting with the dark areas and going into the light areas. And that's the basis of our transition. Now, what we need to do is to animate this so that that happens over the duration of the clip. Now, I don't want to use keyframes because I want this to be variable in length so that you can have it any length you want. And so I'm going to use a new Davinci Resolve 17 feature, which is the modifier called the Anim Curve. And I'm going to apply that to both the low and the high values. Okay, So what the Anim Curve does basically is it takes this value or this value and it runs it from 0 to 1 over the duration of your clip, and that's it. So we are going to right click on the word low, we're going to come to modify with, and we're going to put Anim Curves. As we do that, you see our little keyframe dot lights up because we've got a modifier, and our modifier tab now becomes available. I'm going to do the same to the high value, modify with Anim Curves. Now if we hit play, you'll see that both values travel from 0 to 1, and you have your Luma Fade transition. Now I have this set up in mind so that I can switch between the fade starting in the dark area or the fade starting in the light area. So the first thing we need to do is make some kind of switch or controller that we can toggle between the two. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come into my Luma Keyer node. You can do it on any of the nodes, but just to make things easier, I'm going to do it in the Luma Keyer node. I'm going to right click and I'm going to go to Edit Controls. When you do that, this panel pops up and we want to make a new control, and we're going to call it Direction. I'm now going to click anywhere in the box, and you see that the ID has changed to match the name. For my purposes that's a bit long, so I'm going to drop it down to DIR. So we want this control to be a number. We want it to be on the controls page of our Luma Keyer. So we'll select controls, and then we're going to come into the input controls, and we're going to scroll down until we find combo control. What this does is it lets us make a drop down box. We only want 2 items in this. We want dark first, and then we click add, and then we want light first and click add, and then we click OK, and you see our control has now appeared here. Now using this control we can return a value of 0 for dark and 1 for light, and we can use various expressions which reference this control to make different things happen. What we're going to do is we're going to go into our, so let me just bring this out and let me just explain something so that you can see what I'm doing. I'm going to put a new Luma key in for a second. Cool. So at the minute, as you remember, our current setup has the key coming from the dark areas first and into the light. To get it to go from the light areas first and into the dark, we need to first invert the mask, and we need to have our starting point at 1, so it effectively comes backwards. So what we're going to do is we're going to add expressions to the invert button, and then we're going to add expressions to the Anim Curves to tell it where to start and where to end. So let me get rid of that one and put our working one back in. So we will start with our invert button because that's the easiest one. Basically, if we want the dark to fade out first, then we don't need it inverted, so it stays unchecked or has a value of 0. If we want light to fade out first, then we need to invert our Luma Keyer. so that needs to have a value of 1 or a check mark. So to do that, we're going to use an expression. So right click on invert, select expression, and we're going to use an if expression. So we've got if with double I, parentheses, I'm going to remove that because just for the sake of making life easy, I'm going to rename this Luma Keyer node. So select the node, hit F2 and just rename it. Now it makes our expressions a bit easier. So back to our invert, right click, expression, and as I say, it's an if expression. So if parentheses LK dot dir, which is our direction control here, leave a space, 2 equal signs, another space, is 0, then return a value of 0, and if it's not, then it returns a value of 1, like so. So if you remember, dark was 0, so if we've got dark, our invert is off. If we've got light, our invert is on. As I say, that's the easy bit. Now, staying with dark, we want values of 0 on both our low and high values here. If we change to light first, we want values of 1, but we need the values to decrease instead of increase. So coming into our modifiers, you see we've now got 2 modifiers, an Anim Curve on low and an Anim Curve on high. So if we open one of those up, the scaling, a scale of 1 means that your transition or your value will go from 0 to 1 if the offset is at 0. So what we're going to do is we're going to put expressions on both the scale and the offset, and again it's the same process. We're going to right click, hit expression, and we're going to put another if expression in here. So we're going to have if with 2 i's, parentheses, LK dir equals 0, then we want the scale to be 1. If it's not 0, we want the scale to be -1. And for the offset, the expression is going to be, so now we're going to do our expression for our offset. So again, expression, and we're going to say if with 2 i's, parentheses, LK dot dir equals 0. Then we're going to return a value of 0. If it's not 0, we're going to return a value of 1. So now we're going to make those 2 expressions and we're going to put them into our high Anim curve as well. So I'm just going to pin this here and I'm going to double click high to open it. And then I'm going to come to scaling again. I'm going to click scale and put an expression, click offset and put an expression, and then I'm just going to copy and paste. So scale, Command C, Command V, and then offset, Command C, Command V. Now, all being equal, if we now go back to our tools page, we've got our selector. If you notice, at the minute it's set to dark, so the invert is off and our two starting points are at 0, and as we run through, the image fades in the dark areas first and then eventually in the light areas. If we now come to our selector, hit light first, our invert is now on and our start values are at 1, and if we come through, the light will fade first and then the dark will come in afterwards. And that is basically the magic of Anim Curves and a couple of little expressions, and that is your reversible Luma Fade transition. If we now come back to the edit tab, give it a second to cache, we have our transition. What we don't have as yet is our control on the edit page, so to get the benefit of that we're going to need to create a macro. So we're going to go back into the Fusion page, and we're going to make a little macro out of this. It's fairly straightforward, it's not too intimidating. To make the macro, we don't need our media in and out, and we don't need our media out. Sorry, we don't need our two media ins and we don't need our media out. What we need is these two nodes. And all we do is we select them both, right click and go to macro, create macro. And we can call this what we want. I'm going to call it that for the sake of argument. So now we need to work down this list of scary looking things, but to be fair, it's not that scary. You see a list of your two nodes, so you've got your LK node, which is your Luma Keyer, and you've got your merge node, which is here. Don't need to worry about the merge node, nothing's happening in that. We do need to worry about our Luma Keyer node. So input is got, because we need the input off here, so that's fine, we can leave it where it is. If you click on the node and look in the inspector, you can see what it is we need to do, and on our control page we need to look for this. So we've got controls. If you flick down, right at the bottom you see direction. If you just tick that, and that's literally all there is to this macro. You can then close everything up, close, and it will ask you if you want to save. Just check yes, and then we need to pick somewhere to save it to. Now by default it goes into Resolve's macro folder. We don't want it in the macro folder, we want it in the titles folder. This is where things are going to get a bit funky depending on what system you're working on. On a Mac, you just need to follow my steps. Basically you find Mac HD, double click it, library, application support, Blackmagic design. I think from library onwards it's the same for both systems, but you'd need to check your own system, or I'll find out the link and put it in the description. So once we're in Blackmagic design, Davinci Resolve, and then you need to flick down, you go past Fusion. If Fusion's not open, double click on Fusion, keep going down, templates, edit, and finally transitions, and that's where we're going to save it to. So you hit save and you're done. Now Again, I think this is new since 17. Give it a second to do its worry thing. Come back to the edit page. Now in 16 you had to restart Fusion, but in 17 I don't think you do. So we can get rid of our transition. We can come to the search bar, because I've got loads of transitions and I can't be bummed scrolling through them, and just type Luma, and you find all your transitions with Luma in the title. Now I've got a few here because I've been working on this for a little while to get it to where I've got it. This is the one we just created, Luma Fade tutorial. You can now bring that, drop it on your timeline, and you see we've got our controller. So we can change which way our fade happens. So you could come back to the start of your clip. We've got the light first, so the water will fade out first. And there you go. We can equally change it to dark. And this time the scenery will go first. And that's it. Just a little ditty thing. As I say, it sort of introduces you a bit to Anim Curves. I've got another transition thing that I'll get out in the next couple of weeks. I'm not quite sure when yet because I'm still kind of working on it. That uses the Anim Curves more extensively, and will be a sort of multi-transition thing that you can select sort of spins and possibly zooms and slides and stuff all within one sort of transition. So you'd slap it on the timeline and do with it as you wished. As I say, these are totally sort of responsive, so you can have them as long or as short as you want and they'll still work. And there you go. Cool. Well, I hope you kind of found that useful, understandable. It gets a bit funky at times, a bit enjoyable maybe. Who knows, listening to my dulcet tones, and I will catch you with something else at some point in the future. Feel free to subscribe if you're not already, hit the like button, hit the notification and all that kind of jazz. Much appreciated, and I will see you again soon. Cheers!